Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And if you've never watched a movie about superheroes in your life, you're going to be fine here. We're just going to talk about it for a second. Do you remember the part in Infinity War when Captain America is the last thing standing between Thanos and the final stone that Thanos needs to collect, and this peon human with this goofy outfit grabs Thanos by the glove that holds all the stones of power that he's going to use to wreck the universe. And Captain America's gritting his teeth and digging in and being pushed back in the dirt and summoning every bit of force he has. He can't come up with a strategy to really stop the problem, but he's just going to try his absolute hardest. Nothing else in the world matters. All I am focused on is keeping this guy from getting that rock in his glove. It's so simple. And as an audience, you get tipped off to the focus and singularity of Captain America by that moment where Josh Brolin's CGI captured Thanos pauses and looks at him like, what is this? And you can even tell there's this moment of admiration there. That might be my favorite moment in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. I told you this is all going to make sense, whether you like superhero movies or not. Here's what I'm driving at. That moment of singularity is something that I think we both admire and don't totally know what to do with. And if you've been hanging out with me through this trek through Matthew that we're doing, you know that term singularity has come up a lot. But this theme is all over the book of Matthew, this idea that there is nothing more valuable than the kingdom and the king. That's why you get the little micro parables about the buried treasure, about the pearl. This stuff deserves your attention. Everything else is fading. Every other competing idea or thing to be focused on cannot deliver in the same way that this kingdom and king stuff can. And in this ongoing conversation that you and I have been having, this prompted by Jesus' teachings at the beginning of Matthew chapter 19 about love and marriage and all of that kind of business, I keep saying that we are going to be tempted to look at this passage through the lenses of social debates that we're having right now. But if we want to understand the text, we have to look at it through the lenses of that Captain America-like singularity that Jesus seems to be teaching is the right response to the kingdom. If you really understand the value of this, you would be throwing yourself at it. If you really understood the threat that Thanos poses to the universe, you would dig in your heels as the last line of defense and do everything in your power to keep him from getting that last stone. So if you've been listening to these passages that we've been reading, you're like, I don't know if those are great pointers for a healthy, fulfilling marriage. And it doesn't seem like enough effort is being put into the counseling side here on the part of the Bible to really speak through the centuries to how we can be most happy. Well, I think you're hearing it right. I mean, surely the Bible is concerned with marriages that thrive, but the assumption of the Bible throughout is that the most meaningful relationships, the most meaningful marriages are all run through the filter, the matrix of the truest, realist thing, that being one's relationship with God. So we were in 1 Corinthians 7 yesterday, where we get all of this stuff again that seems to be flowing out of the question of, should we even bother to get married? What do we do with sexual urges and that aspect of human yearning for intimacy? And to summarize a very long chapter in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that we don't have time to break down here, Paul would seem to be saying that whatever convictions you have or whatever you're going to do with the be single, get married thing, for the kingdom citizen, all of that decision-making, all of that opinion-making should be run through the decision-making matrix of the kingdom and the value of the kingdom and the king, and that being the central focus of things. I like the way this topic gets addressed in Ephesians chapter 5. When I do weddings, this is the passage that I always use. And the context here is a little bit different. Paul isn't yelling at the Ephesian church. There isn't friction or chaos. It doesn't look like the Ephesian church had asked about this. Paul is trying to paint a picture for people as the years go by and Jesus hasn't returned yet for what it's going to look like to have kids and have family and have love and where the sexuality thing fits into all of that. And so in verse 22 of Ephesians 5, he says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he's the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything." And as we talked about yesterday, if that were the entire passage, that would seem imbalanced and weird and like it doesn't really complete the image quite properly. It would just seem like sort of an odd subjugating passage that speaks across the centuries and allows for weird, imbalanced, unhealthy relationships now. But it doesn't end there, and we'll get to how it doesn't end there in just a second. What you're getting here instead then is not just an ideal version of marriage or pointers for how to do that well, and that does come up in places, but more so what you're getting here is the curtain pulled back on the theological reality of what marriage illustrates. If that is the most intimate, meaningful human relationship ever, how much more intimate and meaningful is the relationship between the kingdom citizen and the king? In this analogy, then, the wife is like the church, laying down her rights to the king, laying down her rights to Christ. But then it goes on in verse 25, and the whole thing evens out or even turns a little bit inequitable the other way. It says, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." Well, in Matthew 19, Jesus hasn't done that quite yet. He hasn't gone to the cross. And so people aren't understanding at that point the full implications of what Jesus is saying about the significance of the imagery of marriage and where all of that is headed in the age of the church. But here in Ephesians 5, we get a much clearer sense of what that means. Wives, submit to your husbands and everything. That sounds oppressive, but then it flips around and it's like, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church. Well, how did he love the church? He gave himself up for her. Oh, like by getting repeatedly nailed to wood until he died to death. My goodness. So what we're getting here is not something that props up the patriarchy and should create inequality and imbalance. What we're getting here is a picture of maximum and complete mutual submission. And maybe it strikes your ears as odd to imagine Jesus submitting or laying down his rights, but that is what the text teaches. Remember, Jesus said very clearly that he didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Well, that sounds a lot like Ephesians 5:25 that we just read. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Verse 5 of Philippians 2, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. This business about the church laying down its rights and following Christ the King, and this business about Jesus laying down his rights and even giving himself up for the church, going to the cross, this is all over the New Testament. Paul is just connecting the dots right here and likening it to marriage and how marriage is supposed to be. And listen to the mutual submission that is on display in the rest of Ephesians chapter 5 in this description of ideal marriage. You set aside stuff we like to fight about. This is actually beautiful. This is a description of what it looks like to have two people fully give themselves to each other. So husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it just as Christ does the church. For we're members of his body, and for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh, which is exactly what Jesus was saying in Matthew 19:5 that springboarded this whole conversation. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. And I say once more, if you set aside the internet bickering and the things that we fight about, and you set aside, or rather take as a cautionary tale, the weird outlier abuses of marriage and not mutual submission, gross expressions of marriage, and you look at this as something that is marriage viewed through the singular lens of the king and the kingdom being the most valuable thing, then what I think you see is something that is truly beautiful and equitable and desirable and that is likely to work. What you see is the most intimate level of human relationship. But remember, it's the same Paul who here and elsewhere, and it's the same Jesus being quoted there in Ephesians chapter 5 from his remarks back in Matthew 19, who suggests that despite how beautiful this relationship is and how it's maximum intimacy, that still it's probably going to make a ton of sense for some people to take a pass on it. The reality is going to be that some people want this kind of relationship, and because of their focus on the kingdom or other circumstances, it doesn't happen. And the language of the text consistently is that even though this is awesome and amazing, there's something even better that this is meant to point to. I thought about wading into how marriage and celibacy and everything is played out throughout church history a little bit in this episode, but we've been on this topic for a long time, and I'm really excited to get on to the next part where some little kids come up to hang out with Jesus and they get barked at, and Jesus is like, I'm with the kids on this one. So we'll do that next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.